President Trump, I come to you from the future with a critical warning that demands your attention. As a leader who has the power to shape history, I urge you to look beyond the current climate narratives being pushed, narratives that blame the people for natural cycles beyond their control, and focus on the truth of what is coming. You have the ability to steer the country in a direction that prepares for what is ahead, not for what others are telling people is a human-made disaster. I urge you to take a step back and study the history of the Dust Bowl, a time that began nearly 100 years ago in the 1930s. A century ago, millions of Americans experienced something similar to what is approaching now. Droughts lasting years, dust storms that blotted out the sky, and a massive agricultural collapse that left families struggling to survive. The Dust Bowl wasn't just a localized event. It impacted vast areas stretching across the American Midwest, parts of Canada, and all the way to New York. During that time, many regions went for 8 years without significant rain or snow, while storms raged and crops failed. The truth is, this event is not unique. This is a cycle, and one that repeats approximately every 100 years. The last cycle ended in the 1940s, but we are about to enter the next one, beginning around 2030. However, this time will likely be more intense. The extreme heat caused by the environmental damage from the BP oil spill and the effects of Fukushima have already begun altering ocean currents and atmospheric patterns. These changes will exacerbate the natural cycle and intensify the storms, droughts, and overall destruction. The people of this nation, and indeed of North America, need to be prepared for what is coming. The kind of storms that ravaged the country 100 years ago are set to return, but the ones we face may be far worse. The heat will be more extreme, the droughts longer, the storms more powerful. If we fail to prepare, the suffering will be greater. Here's what they will experience if we do not act now. Dust storms that block out the sun, potentially lasting for days, weeks, or even months, just as the survivors of the Dust Bowl did. Crops will wither and the land will turn barren, causing food shortages and economic hardship. The Gulf Stream will continue to weaken, and the damage caused by past events like BP's spill will cause ocean temperatures to fluctuate and disrupt weather systems, creating more unpredictable and violent weather. People will suffer from dehydration, hunger, and loss, much like the generations before us. But this time it may stretch even longer than 8 years, making it more critical that we take steps to mitigate the damage. And yet, what we are being told is the cause of all of this. The idea that human emissions of CO2 are to blame would distract from the real issue. The narrative is being manipulated to push control, taxes, and regulations under the guise of saving the planet. But the truth is that these storms and weather extremes are a recurring part of the Earth's natural cycle. The elites in power know this. They have known it for years and have used it to manipulate the people and control the economy. This is where your leadership can make a difference. President Trump, you can reject the flawed narrative being pushed by the UN and others. You can educate the people about this repeating cycle and its real causes. You can ensure that we are ready to withstand what is coming, not through fear or false blame, but through preparedness and unity. Stockpiling food, water, and resources is the key. We must begin now, ahead of the storms, ahead of the hardships. We have 5 years, just 5 years before this cycle begins to unfold. But if we act now, we can ensure that when the droughts hit and the storms roll in, we are not left unprepared. The people of this country will remember those who stood firm and refused to let fear and manipulation control them. Do not let the world fall into the trap of believing that this natural cycle is the result of human activity. This is not our fault. It is a challenge we must face, but we will face it stronger, united, and prepared. It is not too late to change course, but the window is closing. History will judge the decisions you make in the next few years. The choice is yours, President Trump. You have the power to lead the people into a new era of truth and resilience, or you can let the cycle repeat in ignorance. The future is in your hands. Act now before it's too late. P.S. If you choose to ignore the truth and continue to let the false narrative drive policy and action, the consequences will be dire. The people, Mr. President, will not be prepared. They will not understand the true cause of the devastation. As a result, when the great storms return, worse than they were in the 1930s, entire regions of this country will be obliterated. The land will dry up. The sun will be blotted out by the dust and the ash from the storms that will roll across the Midwest and beyond. The soil will turn to powder, and once fertile farmlands will become desolate. Families will watch their crops fail, and their homes will become buried under layers of dust. Water will be scarce, rivers will dry up, and the air will become so thick with dust and particulate matter that it will be unsafe to breathe. The extreme heat will make even the simplest tasks unbearable. People will suffer from dehydration and exhaustion in the sweltering heat, and without access to sufficient food, hunger will become widespread. People will watch as entire crops wither and die, while the government fails to provide enough aid or resources. Famine will spread. Communities will struggle to survive as the food stores deplete, and the nation's infrastructure begins to break down under the strain. The economy will collapse under the weight of this disaster. In the cities, the crisis will be just as severe. Large urban centers will be overwhelmed. The infrastructure will buckle under the influx of refugees seeking shelter and safety. Shelters will overflow. Disease will spread through the population due to the poor conditions, while the healthcare system collapses under the pressure. People will perish by the thousands. The elderly, the sick, and the children will be the most vulnerable, but everyone will suffer, from the workers in the fields to the families living in the cities. There will be no refuge, no safe haven from the destruction. Food prices will skyrocket, and supply chains will break down completely. The government's failure to act, their failure to prepare the people for the truth, will be blamed on the ones who had the power to change the course, but chose to ignore the warnings. The public's anger will rise as they realize the catastrophe could have been avoided if only they had known the truth. In the worst case, the population will dwindle as starvation, heat exhaustion, and disease take their toll. The country, once the most powerful on earth, will be reduced to a state of misery and despair. The landscape will look like the desolation of the 1930s Dust Bowl, but with modern cities swallowed by dust, mass graves dotting the countryside, and desperate citizens turning on each other for the last scraps of food and water. The future of America will depend on whether or not you, Mr. President, choose to act now and guide the nation towards preparation, truth, and resilience. If you fail, the people will pay the price. Pay it in lives lost, livelihoods destroyed, and a nation brought to its knees. But if you take a stand, there is still hope. The choice is yours, and history will remember your decision. Mr. President, as Ronald Reagan once said, if no one else will, then we will. If we must, we shall. And if we are the last to stand, we will stand, alone if necessary, but we will stand. You have a unique moment in history before you. You have the opportunity to be the leader who refuses to be swayed by false narratives, to stand firm in the face of overwhelming opposition. Like Reagan, you have the chance to be the one who leads even when others falter, who chooses to stand on principle when the world tells you to stand down. The decisions you make in the coming years will shape not only the future of this nation, but the future of millions around the world. It's a burden that only those who are willing to stand strong, even when alone, are capable of bearing. If you take the reins, speak the truth, and fight against this false narrative, you will inspire the people to rise up with you. And the steps you take now will determine whether the American people are left vulnerable or are empowered to face the storm. This is your moment, Mr. President, to act not just a politician, but as a protector of the people. History will remember the decisions you make today, and so will the generations that follow. To prepare for the coming climate events, which are part of a 100-year cycle, the U.S. needs a comprehensive strategy to build large-scale storage and infrastructure to ensure the survival of the population through these difficult years. The main objectives are: 1. Food and grain storage. Each state needs to establish massive storage facilities to stockpile essential grains like wheat, corn, rice, and other staples. These reserves should be stored in climate-controlled silos to protect the quality of the food. Grains, wheat, corn, rice, oats, barley, these will be the staples for survival. The amount needed will depend on the population, but as a rough estimate, wheat, 90 billion pounds per year. Corn, similar quantities adjusted for use as both food and animal feed. Rice and oats, smaller quantities but still crucial. Food preservation. Along with grain, canned foods, dried goods, and preserved vegetables will need to be stored. These would help bridge gaps during years of poor harvests. 2. Fuel reserves. Fuel is essential for transportation and power. Each state will need to create reserves of fuel, including gasoline, diesel, and propane. Ensure that the country has enough to keep vehicles moving and to heat homes during harsh winters. Alternative fuels. As part of energy security, investments in solar, wind, and biofuels could also help reduce the dependency on fossil fuels. Storage capacity. Fuel storage tanks and backup generators will need to be strategically placed across the country, focusing on areas most vulnerable to supply disruptions. 3. Water reserves. Water, being critical for survival, will also need to be stored. Water supply. Large-scale water storage and purification facilities are needed. Desalination plants on coastal areas could help provide a steady supply in case droughts occur. Rainwater harvesting. Encouraging citizens to invest in personal water storage systems and make sure public facilities have systems in place to capture and treat rainwater. 4. Medical and other essentials. In addition to food, fuel, and water, the U.S. will need to create stockpiles of medicines, first aid supplies, and medical equipment, sanitation supplies to prevent disease outbreaks, seeds and farming equipment to allow local farming to resume if supply chains break down. 5. Building the infrastructure in each state. State-by-state storage. It's crucial that every state builds its own self-sufficient storage and distribution systems. These should be spread across urban and rural areas so that in times of hardship, no region is left behind. Regional hubs. Larger distribution centers can be created in major cities or agricultural regions, and smaller community stores can be set up in less populated areas. Transport networks. Roads, railways, and shipping lanes should be maintained and improved to ensure that food, fuel, and other essentials can be quickly and efficiently moved across states. 6. Timeline and action plan. Each of these storage systems should be built progressively over the next 5 years, leading up to 2030. Year 1 to 2, 2025 to 2026. Begin the construction of large grain silos and fuel storage tanks. Focus on creating food production partnerships with local farmers to make sure surplus food can be stored. Year 3-4, 2020-28. Continue expanding food storage and increase water and fuel reserves. Build medical supplies stockpiles and prepare emergency relief networks. Year 5, 2029. complete the final phase of food and fuel storage, and ensure that logistics networks are operational across the country. Critical infrastructure, dams and water reservoirs, ensure that water is distributed and stored before the worst effects of the coming cycle. Renewable energy stations, set up more renewable energy sources to lessen dependence on fuel. 7. Preventing suffering during hard times. The ultimate goal of these preparations is to ensure that no one goes hungry, that everyone has access to water, and that medical supplies are available. These efforts should be seen as a lifeline for the American population.
The acres wide, and you can have it your command, if you will be my bride. Yes, sir, I know you're very fine.
What was worse than anything is when we had that damn Dust Bowl. There wasn't no vegetation whatsoever, and it just blowed all the time. You'd have to take sheets and stick them in a tub of water and hang them over the doors to keep the dust from coming in the house and getting in your lungs.
Yes, sir, I know you've a very fine farm and it's 60 acres wide. But who would stay with me at night while you are playing your card? Madam, I never did do such a...
I remember when my wife used to stretch a sheet over our bed, and you'd get up the next morning and write your name on top of that sheet in the dust. And it was finer than flour. It was awful. And we put up with that down there about, I don't remember anymore, but I'd say 6 or 7 years. It was bad. Sometimes you'd go to town in one of those dust storms, have to for supplies. You'd get in town, maybe couldn't get back home for 2 days and nights. It'd just blow like snow to where you couldn't see nothing. You couldn't find the road, and you'd just have to stay wherever it caught you. It'd drift the dirt right over the fence posts and fences, right over buildings. I've seen buildings 10 feet high. Dirt drifted right over them. In them dirt storms. And once in a while you'd lose cattle. That dirt would get in their nose and just stop it up. Nose and eyes.
Madam, I never did do such a thing, for I never did think it was right. And if you will be my bride, I won't stay away one night. Yes, sir,
Dirt would fill the lungs and cause coughing, tightness of the chest, labored breathing, and shortness of breath. Children and the elderly were affected the most, with deaths being common. Many were hospitalized because of this condition, but it is difficult to tell exact numbers because medical records from the era were either not kept or not well preserved. Those who lived in the Dust Bowl tried many different methods to combat the dust and keep themselves healthy. Parents would have their children sleep with sheets over their beds, like tents, to reduce the amount of dust they inhaled during their sleep. Dust masks and wet cloths over the mouth were other methods that some used to try and prevent dust inhalation.
They tried to sell anything they could just to have a potato or flour to make fried dough. Soups were thin. A can of sardines was saved over several days.
In that dear state of Oklahoma, in the city where buildings are high, I laid on my pillow so hopeless, looking through my tin shack at the sky. I got up early next morning, out in the cold I did creep, walked off without any breakfast, and left 2 hungry babies asleep.
Worst dust storms in our history turned day into night across enormous areas from the Midwest to the Rockies. Millions of acres of precious topsoil turned into a blizzard of dirt and grime, impoverishing countless small farmers. The era of the Dust Bowl and the Okie was at hand.